Fredericksburg fiasco, the battle that should have never happened. The year was 1862, and the American Civil War had become a brutal grind. The country was tearing itself apart, and neither side could seem to find the upper hand. After the bloody stalemate at the Battle of Antietam in September, where both sides suffered staggering losses, President Abraham Lincoln desperately needed a victory. The war, already unpopular, was dragging on. Soldiers were exhausted, resources stretched thin, and political pressure on both the battlefield and the home front was suffocating. The people needed hope, and Lincoln needed a general who could deliver. Enter Major General Ambrose Burnside, a man whose name was more famous for his impressive facial hair than his military prowess. His distinctive whiskers, thick and sweeping, were so iconic that they birthed the term sideburns. However, for all the facial flair, Burnside was far less enthusiastic about commanding an army. The truth was, he had already turned down Lincoln's offer to lead the Army of the Potomac twice, insisting that he didn't feel capable of such a colossal responsibility. But when General George McClellan was finally dismissed after Antietam, there was no one else available, and Burnside reluctantly accepted. Burnside's humility bordered on self-doubt, but he wasn't one to back down from duty. A Rhode Island native, Burnside had a modest upbringing, and he made his way through the military ranks thanks to his engineering skills rather than battlefield brilliance. He had served honorably, though his leadership was seen as cautious. Still, he had earned the loyalty of his men, in part because of his straightforwardness and in part because he looked like the kind of guy who would share a beer with you after a long day of marching. Fredericksburg, Virginia, was about to be ground zero for one of the most frustrating and chaotic battles of the Civil War. A town known more for its peaceful location along the Rappahannock River than for military history, Fredericksburg was now a key objective for the Union Army. Its strategic position opened a clear path to Richmond, the Confederate capital, and General Ambrose Burnside thought this would be his ticket to fame. Little did he know that this river crossing would be more like walking into a buzzsaw. The plan was simple enough: cross the Rappahannock River using pontoon bridges, take Fredericksburg, and march on to Richmond. Easy, right? Well, that was before the infamous bureaucratic miscommunication that nearly derailed the whole thing. Burnside had ordered pontoons weeks earlier, expecting them to arrive in time for a swift, decisive strike. But, as is often the case in war, and in government, the wheels of bureaucracy turned slowly, so slowly that the pontoons didn't arrive until much later. Rumor has it the delay was due to a mix-up in supply orders. Instead of being shipped to Fredericksburg, the pontoons were initially sent on a scenic tour of Virginia, including a lovely layover in Alexandria. By the time they finally rolled into camp, Burnside's decisive strike had lost all momentum. A logistical blunder had just handed the Confederates a golden opportunity. While Burnside stewed over the delay, General Robert E. Lee, never one to waste time, used it to his full advantage. Lee, a calm and calculating leader with Virginia blood running deep in his veins, knew the terrain like the back of his hand. He took one look at the high ground overlooking Fredericksburg, Marye's Heights, and knew exactly what to do. He ordered General James Longstreet, his right-hand man, to fortify the position with artillery and infantry, effectively turning it into a fortress. Longstreet, the picture of cool-headed Southern grit, relished the challenge. As his troops dug in, he muttered, "Let 'em come, boys. We'll give 'em a proper welcome." His men laughed, knowing their general's wry sense of humor. But Longstreet wasn't just preparing for a battle, he was getting ready to put on a clinic in defensive warfare. Meanwhile, as dawn broke on December 11th, Burnside's engineers finally began constructing the pontoon bridges under a gray, dreary sky. Snowflakes started to drift down, adding a bitter chill to the air. The Union soldiers grumbled about the weather as they struggled to assemble the heavy planks and pontoons. It wasn't long before they realized they weren't just fighting the elements, they were also fighting the Confederates. From their fortified positions, Confederate sharpshooters, cleverly concealed in the buildings along the riverbank, took potshots at the Union engineers. Every time a Union soldier so much as lifted a hammer, a bullet zipped by. Burnside, watching from afar, saw his engineers dropping like flies and had a choice quote for the situation: "This is not going well." The sharpshooters were relentless, and so was Longstreet's artillery. Every few minutes, a Confederate cannon would boom from the heights, sending explosions echoing across the river. The Union engineers, already freezing in the cold, ducked and dodged as best they could, but it was a losing battle. "Damn them and their infernal accuracy," one of the engineers shouted, as a plank he was carrying splintered under fire. Burnside, growing increasingly frustrated, ordered something no one had ever seen before: a massive artillery bombardment of the town itself. For hours, Union cannons roared, sending shells crashing into Fredericksburg, reducing much of it to rubble. Buildings crumbled, and streets were torn apart, but the Confederate sharpshooters remained stubbornly entrenched. It wasn't until Union forces began ferrying across the river in small boats, fighting house to house through the ruined town, that the bridges were finally completed. Burnside muttered to one of his staff officers, "Well, we've crossed the damn river, but at what cost?" With the pontoon bridges finally in place, Burnside's army began crossing the river in force. As Union troops marched through the smoldering remains of Fredericksburg, a sense of unease settled over them. The town, once bustling with life, now resembled a ghostly ruin. Snow had begun to fall in earnest, blanketing the ground in a cold, white silence. It was an eerie contrast to the violence that had just taken place. Despite holding the town, the Union soldiers knew the real challenge lay ahead: Marye's Heights. The Confederate army was dug in, and Burnside's officers were not optimistic about the coming assault. Generals Edwin Sumner, Joseph Hooker, and William Franklin all gathered to discuss the situation. But the mood was tense. Hooker, known for his brashness, was the first to speak up. "This is madness," he said, pacing angrily. "Look at those heights. They're dug in like ticks on a hound. A frontal assault will be suicide." Franklin, always more measured, agreed. "We'll be throwing our men against a stone wall, literally. Burnside's plan is foolhardy." Sumner, the oldest of the group, tried to play peacemaker. Now, gentlemen," he said in his grandfatherly way, "the general has a plan. We're soldiers. We follow orders." But even Sumner couldn't deny the reality. The Confederate positions were nearly impregnable, and everyone knew it. As night fell, the Union soldiers huddled in the freezing streets, waiting for the inevitable. Some shared stories to pass the time, while others sharpened their bayonets in grim silence. The snowfall thickened, adding to the surreal atmosphere of impending doom. On the Confederate side, the mood was markedly different. Lee and Longstreet, having overseen the preparation of their defenses, rested easy. Lee, ever the gentleman, was calm and polite as he discussed the situation with Longstreet over a cup of coffee. "General Burnside has a large army," Lee said thoughtfully, "but he is not using it wisely." Longstreet, with a sly grin, replied, "Let him come, sir. We'll show him what happens when you march against a fortified position." They both knew that Marye's Heights was all but unbeatable. Their men, well rested and positioned on the high ground, were confident in their ability to repel any Union assault. The early hours of December 13, 1862, dawned cold and gray, with a winter chill biting at the soldiers' faces. The Union Army, commanded by General Ambrose Burnside, awoke to a day that would go down in history as one of the most misguided military disasters of the Civil War. On the other side, the Confederate Army, led by General Robert E. Lee, was dug in on the formidable heights overlooking Fredericksburg, their cannons pointed directly at the advancing Union forces. The setting was perfect, that is, if you were rooting for a monumental failure. At dawn, Burnside, perched on the banks of the Rappahannock River with his signature whiskers flowing in the wind, gave the order that would seal his fate, and quite possibly his military career. His plan? A full frontal assault against the entrenched Confederate positions on Marye's Heights, a strategy that would make even the most seasoned chess player question Burnside's sanity. To lead this ill-fated attack was none other than General Edwin Sumner. Sumner, a man known for his loyalty and bravery, had the distinct, and unfortunate, honor of leading the first wave of Union soldiers into what could only be described as the world's deadliest obstacle course. His men, wrapped in their blue uniforms and facing the open fields ahead, likely exchanged uneasy glances as they prepared to charge directly into a wall of Confederate artillery. "Charge!" Sumner yelled. His troops, showing the kind of obedience you'd expect from soldiers who didn't quite realize the full extent of the horror awaiting them, surged forward, boots crunching through mud, snow, and tangled brush. But here's the twist: the Confederates, perched behind a sturdy stone wall, weren't exactly napping. They were well prepared, rifles locked and loaded. As the Union soldiers advanced up the slope, they were met with a torrent of lead and iron so unrelenting it felt like the heavens themselves were raining death. Confederate artillery roared, and the volleys of rifle fire were so constant that even the birds probably thought twice before flying over the battlefield. General James Longstreet, ever the master of understatement, observed the chaos unfolding from his position on Marye's Heights. He turned to Lee, remarking with the kind of calm confidence that makes you wonder if he had a sixth sense for disaster, "General, we cover that ground now so well that we will comb it as with a fine-tooth comb. A chicken could not live on that field when we open on it." It wasn't chickens on the field, though, it was Sumner's men, falling by the hundreds. The field quickly transformed into a killing ground, the Union soldiers struggling just to make it to the base of the hill. And those who did? They found themselves pinned down, huddled behind whatever little cover they could find, staring helplessly at the Confederate forces perched safely behind their stone wall. As the morning wore on and the battlefield grew littered with Union dead and wounded, one might have expected Burnside to reconsider his strategy. After all, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and expecting different results. But Burnside, ever the optimist, or perhaps the most stubborn general in military history, doubled down. "Send in the next wave," he barked, as if the sheer weight of numbers could somehow overwhelm the well-entrenched Confederates. His commanders, Generals Hooker and Franklin, approached him with all the tact they could muster, subtly suggesting that maybe, just maybe, it was time to rethink this whole frontal assault thing. Hooker, who had a flair for sarcasm, likely raised an eyebrow as he pointed toward the piles of bodies already covering the field. But Burnside? No, Burnside wasn't having it. Driven by some misplaced sense of duty or the pressure of his own ambitions, he ordered wave after wave of Union soldiers into the slaughter. One might wonder if Burnside secretly believed in magic. Perhaps he thought that, eventually, his men would stumble upon some invisible pathway to victory that no one else could see. As the smoke from the Battle of Fredericksburg drifted over the blood-soaked fields, the air was thick with the cries of the wounded and the smell of gunpowder. Among the fallen lay General George Bayard, a Union cavalry commander, his once proud posture now crumpled and broken by the cruel force of a Confederate shell. At just 26 years old, Bayard had risen through the ranks, a man of talent, energy, and hope. But in his final moments, none of that seemed to matter. His military career, his plans for the future, they all seemed like distant memories. As he lay dying, agony searing through his body, his thoughts turned not to the battle raging around him, but to his fiancée. With his breath fading, he whispered to a comrade by his side, "Tell her that I died thinking of her." And just like that, another love story ended on the battlefield. Another future vanished in the roar of cannon fire. But while Bayard's final moments were marked by personal sorrow, elsewhere on the battlefield, a very different kind of heroism was unfolding, one that transcended sides and uniforms. As the brutal clash between Union and Confederate forces pressed on, a young Confederate soldier stood watching from behind his unit's position at Marye's Heights. His name was Richard Kirkland, a sergeant in the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, and what he saw before him troubled his soul. Across the field, Union soldiers who had been wounded in the earlier assault were crying out in pain and thirst. Some begged for water, their voices barely rising above the din of battle. They were stranded between the lines, unable to move, and no one dared approach them for fear of being shot. But Kirkland couldn't stand it any longer. These men need help, he thought, and though they wore the uniform of the enemy, to him, they were just men, suffering, dying men. He went to his commanding officer, General Kershaw, and requested permission to carry water to the wounded Union soldiers. Initially, the general refused, fearing Kirkland would be shot down the moment he stepped out from behind their defenses. But Kirkland insisted, his young face determined. Finally, Kershaw relented. With a few canteens slung over his shoulder, Kirkland climbed the wall and made his way toward the wounded Union soldiers. At first, both sides held their breath, guns poised to fire. But as they realized what Kirkland was doing, a hush fell over the battlefield. The guns went silent. The battle paused, if only for a few minutes, as soldiers on both sides watched in awe. Kirkland reached the first of the Union wounded and knelt beside him. He lifted the soldier's head gently and gave him a drink from his canteen, wiping his brow as he spoke to him softly. Then, he moved to the next soldier, and the next, offering water and what comfort he could. For hours, Kirkland moved across the battlefield, bringing relief to men who only moments earlier had been his mortal enemies. When Kirkland returned to the Confederate lines, the silence was replaced by admiration. Both Union and Confederate soldiers had watched him risk his life to bring water to those in need. He became known as the Angel of Marye's Heights. But Richard Kirkland's story didn't end with that act of mercy. He continued to fight bravely throughout the war, but like so many young men of his time, his story was cut short. In September 1863, during the Battle of Chickamauga, Kirkland was killed in action, just 20 years old. His fellow soldiers spoke of him with great respect, and after the war, his memory endured. He wasn't just remembered as a soldier, he was remembered as a symbol of humanity in the midst of war's brutality. In the years following the war, both Union and Confederate veterans paid tribute to Richard Kirkland. Monuments were erected in his honor, and stories of his bravery spread across the divided nation. His courage, his compassion, and his willingness to see the humanity in his enemies made him one of the few figures from the Civil War who was honored by both sides. His legacy stood as a reminder that, even in the darkest of times, kindness and decency could still shine through. As night fell on December 13th, the Union Army found itself battered, demoralized, and quite frankly, confused as to why they were still charging up that hill. Confederate forces, meanwhile, stood victorious but somber. General Lee, ever the gentleman of war, walked among his men, observing the cost of victory. "It is well that war is so terrible," he reportedly remarked, "or we should grow too fond of it." On the Union side, Burnside's resolve wavered, just a bit. He considered renewing the assault the next day, as if hoping for some miracle. His commanders, however, were having none of it. Hooker, Franklin, and the rest of his officers practically staged an intervention, convincing Burnside that it was time to pack up and go home. Reluctantly, Burnside agreed, his dreams of a glorious victory sinking as fast as his reputation. On the night of December 14th, the Union Army began its quiet retreat across the river. Under the cover of darkness, they slunk away, leaving behind thousands of dead and wounded. The battle had been a disaster, a bloodbath with no strategic gain. Burnside's grand plan had failed spectacularly, and the term Fredericksburg would forever be etched in Union memory as synonymous with senseless slaughter. By the time the battle ended, the Union had suffered nearly 13,000 casualties, while the Confederates counted around 5,000. Burnside's career spiraled faster than a cannonball through the ranks. Lincoln, ever the diplomat, relieved him of command before he could do any more damage. As Burnside slouched away from the front lines, one might imagine him thinking, well, that could have gone better. But Burnside was far from done making military history, though not quite in the way he might have hoped. His next grand escapade would come during the siege of Petersburg, 2 years later in 1864. And, as fate would have it, it would involve a tunnel. Yes, a tunnel. And as you might guess, things didn't exactly go to plan. The siege of Petersburg was a slow, grinding affair, where the Union Army, under General Ulysses S. Grant, was attempting to break through the Confederate defenses. Burnside, eager to redeem himself, came up with a plan so audacious, so bold, and, let's face it, so insane, that it seemed like it might just work: dig a tunnel under the Confederate fortifications, pack it with explosives, and blow a giant hole in their lines. Then, send in the troops through the gap and win the day. Simple, right? For once, the initial part of the plan actually worked. His men dug a tunnel nearly 500 feet long and packed it with 8,000 pounds of explosives. On July 30, 1864, the fuse was lit, and after a few tense moments, the ground shook as the explosion ripped through the Confederate defenses. A massive crater, 170 feet long and 30 feet deep, was left in its wake. The Confederates were stunned. The way was clear. Unfortunately, Burnside's plan to exploit the crater was less well thought out. Instead of sending in trained, fresh troops, Burnside's men, confused and disorganized, rushed into the crater itself, thinking it would provide cover. What they didn't realize was that they had effectively turned themselves into sitting ducks. Confederate soldiers quickly regrouped and fired down into the crater, turning it into a death trap. The Union forces, rather than storming through the breach, were trapped in the very pit they had created. It was a catastrophe of epic proportions, and Burnside once again found himself at the center of a military disaster. The crater that was supposed to be his redemption became his graveyard of reputation. Over 3,500 Union soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in what became known as the Battle of the Crater. Grant, unimpressed by the spectacle, relieved Burnside of command, again, and this time, Burnside quietly faded from the battlefield. After his final removal from command, Burnside wisely decided that perhaps the battlefield wasn't his natural habitat after all. He returned to civilian life, where he enjoyed a more peaceful, if somewhat less adventurous, career. He served as governor of Rhode Island and later as a U.S. senator, where, luckily for him, there were no battles to lead and no tunnels to dig. In the end, Burnside's legacy is a curious one. His name became associated with his facial hair, sideburns, a playful twist on his last name, and with some of the most spectacular failures of the Civil War. Yet, for all his mistakes, Burnside remained a well-liked figure, admired for his personal bravery and good nature, even if his tactical brilliance left much to be desired. As Burnside faded into history, he left behind a legacy of lessons for future military leaders, namely, that sometimes the best battle plan is the one you don't execute at all.